All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down the security rabbit hole to another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. This is Raf coming at you remote from the road today, not from the studio, as you guys can tell. But I've got an awesome guest, and we're gonna talk about AI. One of my favorite topics lately because there's so much weirdness about it. But first. James, good morning or good afternoon, or
Yeah,
I don't
good.
know what
It's
time
still
zone you're
morning
in.
here. It's still morning
Okay.
here on the East Coast. So and it looks like it's going to be a nice day. Hopefully, the person having their tree trimmed outside that window won't come across
Oh,
too much.
geez.
But so far, I think it's been staying pretty quiet.
As long as the tree doesn't come through the window, yeah, I think you'll be fine. Um, we live in a neighborhood that's got that's always somebody's always having trees cut down or trimmed, so that's a regular occurrence. All right, we've got a really kind of a fun guest today. Somebody who knows a lot about a lot. Sounil, welcome to the show. Give us a little background about who you are, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Hi. Thanks for having me on. I'm Sounil Yu. I'm the CTO and co-founder of a company called Gnostic. Prior to that, I used to be the chief scientist at Bank of America. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to share something that I created called the Cyber Defense Matrix. There's a lot of folks, I think, who are hopefully putting it to use. It's a simple mental model. Y'all can check it out if you want to just visit cyberdefensematrix.com.
Cool. Bank of America. I think I've heard of them.
Yeah, small little globally significant financial institution, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah. I think everybody listening is like, oh yeah, I've heard of them. All right, talk to us about your kind of your current thing. What are you doing? What is Gnostic? What are you doing with the current company? And give us a little background on that.
Sure, yeah. So I think the challenge that we see one of just in general, we have so many companies out there pitching AI and whatnot. It's really hard to differentiate. And when I went about studying this problem itself, I discovered something fairly fundamental that seems to be missing in the context of large language models, especially in the context of enterprise focused tools like Copilot, where you're trying to use it for enterprise search. And the problem that we saw was that they lack discretion. They don't really have an understanding of who should have a need to know for what. And what we do instead is we have this one size fits all policy that restricts access to certain things, certain topics. But really, inside of an enterprise, some people do need to know about layoffs. Some people do need to know about M&A. Some people do need to know about harassment issues. And so, how do you properly do knowledge segmentation inside of an AI system? Think about it as I really hate the word, but I'm going to use it here because I think it is actually the closest analogy, which is what does it mean to have zero trust for AI? Okay. What does that notion actually mean? And in the context of networks, it's network segmentation. In the context of AI systems, I think it's knowledge segmentation. But what's the policy for knowledge segmentation? And that's our main focus. We capture the policy for what's the appropriate knowledge segmentation, and we have a lot of different use cases for it. One of them being how do you quickly find oversharing inside of environments like Copilot?
So that's interesting because it's a very that discretion is a very human concept, right? It's not something that machines have any idea of. Uh, Machines tend to be like, do you have the right, credentials? Yes, you can have. Can you have this information? Yes, right. There's no nuance in machines.
Yeah.
So how do you how do you give machines nuance?
Well, it really is by starting with the human to say what is the appropriate need to know for a particular person or group or job function. It is really actually what's already in our heads, but we haven't really codified it. We haven't written it down. And what we're doing is we're systematically capturing that so that it serves as a reference point. Now, we can certainly use machines to help us bootstrap that. But really, at the end of the day, the boundaries that we want to create around knowledge is distinctly different for each organization. And so each organization does need to manage that appropriately. and we're the tool to help manage that. What's nice is though, once you manage it in one place, you don't need to manage it in all these other places, because if you think about it, the nature of need to know is the same for an organization, regardless of whether you're using Salesforce or Atlassian or M365 or whatever else it might be. The concept of it is foundational for all of security, but we really haven't written it down. And again, that's the foundation of what we're doing. We're writing it down so that it becomes a referenceable element.
Is that similar? I mean, even taking AI out of the equation, right? Even before AI was big, right? We still had the problem. I mean, I think every company struggles, right? You have documents out on SharePoint that we don't know who's had, everybody's got access, and you dumped it out there, right? So this has been a fundamental issue before. How does it change when we get to AI? Because are we solving the problem before AI gets it? Or is this something, right, like the inputs to AI? Because I think with Copilot, at least with Microsoft Copilot, it's supposed to be you get access to what your account would have access. So if you had access to that SharePoint, you'd be able to see the data. If you didn't, you wouldn't.
Yeah, but
so it's kind of cleaning it before it comes in. But as these models get trained up and all that, and it kind of loses where did the source come from, are we looking then to better be able to try to tag it in the model to clean it when it comes out?
Yeah. So there's a flawed assumption. So tools like Microsoft Copilot leverages your own permissions as a foundation, of course. But there's a flawed premise in that, which is our permissions are correct. And
right.
We of course know that is not the case.
That's where I was going.
Yeah. So because it's again, we start with this notion of what is it that you have a need to know for. We end up granting access at a more machine level, which is abstracted from this actual idea of need to know. That at the machine level, you're granted access to a file, or you're granted access to a folder or a server, and then people just dump a bunch of stuff into that. And of course, there's a bunch of stuff that exceeds one's need to know. But the notion of need to know is now lost in the lower level, whereas at the higher level, it's not lost and it's still understood in our heads, but it's not translated right appropriately at the machine level. I know your listeners may be listening to this, but I do have a visual, and for those who, if you're watching, I can show you something that may really help crystallize this understanding.
Yeah, I'd love to do that, because I know in our we prepped for these guys, in case you guys don't know, like we prepped these a little bit. And Sounil and I kind of did a quick prep for this. Put that graphic up, because I think that'll be helpful.
Yeah. So I love mental models. Mental models really help shape our thinking. And I think especially in the age of AI and large language models, understanding these mental models are key to really shaping the answers and understanding whether the answers are correct or not. We got a lot of content, and putting a way to organize it, or having a mental model that can help you organize it, it serves as a tremendous tool. And so the mental model I use for this particular problem is something called the DIKW pyramid. So imagine a pyramid. At the bottom, you have data, and then above that, you have information, and then knowledge, and then wisdom. And what we've seen is a progression of technologies that have really moved us up this pyramid, where we now are delivering knowledge tools to knowledge workers and moving the organization into the knowledge age. And so we put out knowledge tools, and what's one of the first things we see? We see oversharing. And so our natural reaction is, oh man, we have a problem at the data and information layers. We have a problem in that we haven't fixed our permissions at the data layer, and we haven't really done the proper data classification at the information layer. So it's a common refrain. And because that's our typical course of action, what that fundamentally does is that when you put those controls at the lower layers, when you start restricting access to data, when you start restricting access to information, your large language model becomes stupid, okay? It becomes dumber. And fundamentally, this is the wrong way to think about it. I mean, we are rolling out knowledge tools to knowledge workers. How do you make knowledge workers more productive? You give them more knowledge. And yet when we shrink the bottom part of this pyramid, we are actually just doing exactly the opposite of that. And we're doing that because of we're trying to fix the oversharing problem. But in the process of doing this, we recreate the undersharing problem that we've started with. I mean, that's why we're trying to roll out these tools, right? And so we think that this is fundamentally the wrong approach.
So, the visual helps because, like, James, we were talking about before you joined us, Sounil, we were talking about the notion that we gotta lock stuff down. We gotta make sure that we have information and data kind of boxed away, and so lots of tight permissions and no admin access, all this kind of stuff, and that seems to be the way we've been solving a lot of these data problems in cyber, because like I said, we James, your SharePoint example, right? Like, oh, it's in SharePoint, but you only the people with the right permissions have that, which is literally everybody, because everybody has access to SharePoint, because nobody's ever done SharePoint permissions properly, like in the history of ever. And so,
or even the local, or even just the file shares, right? Even take SharePoint out. I mean, I remember when I used to do internal pen tests, like all the time we'd come back and like, oh, you've got all these file shares that are open, and we've got web configs with production passwords. We've got, Excel files with all this data in it. I mean, it was always open file shares.
Yeah. I mean, keep in mind, I mean, whether you call it file share or you call it SharePoint, the word share is a foundational element to the word. So it's meant for the purposes of sharing, right?
Yeah.
And if we're turning off that feature effectively of sharing or unsharing, and you put Copilot on top of unsharepoint, you just, again, end up with a stupid Copilot. It becomes a useless Copilot. But again, of course, the challenge is, how do you deal with the oversharing problem? This is where now my point about the pyramid is, what are the right controls at each layer? At the data layer, it's a file permission or folder level permissions. At the information layer, it's based on classification, and usually sensitivity classifications that are relatively crude. It's confidential, it's restricted, it's secret, whatever.
Something nobody else gets right ever.
Right. And anybody who's been in the national security space also recognizes that just because you have a secret clearance doesn't mean that you should have access to all things secret. Instead, it's based on this next level, which is it's based on your need to know. And so we're coming back to essentially that foundational principle. We're saying, let's now understand what but we must understand what everyone's need to know is if we want to properly give these large language models discretion.
All right. So it still kind of blows me away just a little bit that we're talking about discretion with computers effectively, but let's take that as a given. How, right? So my next question is how, because I'm not convinced we're very good at the file level stuff. With the amount of things that people, and James, you've seen it. How many times are we asking, hey, here's a chunk of code, Chat GPT, tell me if what you would do differently. Like, oh, hey, thanks for the hard-coded password. Or thanks for your thanks for putting in some sensitive source code, like all that. How do you teach a computer what? How do you teach it nuance? How do you teach it this kind of stuff?
Well, so let me do a couple things. First is, we use the word discretion here, but keep in mind there's two forms of access control: mandatory access control and discretionary access control. Okay, so the foundation, the notion of discretionary access control is a key aspect of access control to begin with. So just a point to be made there.
Sure.
Now, the notion of discretionary access control at the knowledge level means we're now saying, what are the appropriate topics? What are the appropriate things that you should have a need to know for because of the job function that you're performing? Now, we know that. It's in our heads. Again, we just haven't written it down. And because we haven't written it down, these large language models don't have a reference point, as I mentioned earlier. But where there is a reference point, the large language models are able to adhere to them to some degree. Okay. Now, I want to separate out two parts of the problem, what you would call the policy decision and then the policy enforcement. Okay. So the policy decision, which is, we currently have a mandatory access control that says, if you're using ChatGPT, no one has a need to know for how to build a biological weapon. Okay. You try to go in
Fair
and you
enough.
ask about a biological weapon, it says, sorry, you don't have a need to know. Okay. The enforcement is part of what you're asking. How good is the enforcement? Can you bypass that enforcement because you've done some prompt engineering and hacking and so on and so forth? And the answer is yes. You can absolutely bypass that enforcement. OpenAI and pick any foundation model and anybody out there, and there's a way around it. But I want to go back to the foundational principle, which is, do you have a need to know for that? And that policy definition, the policy decision, is what we're systematically capturing.
Okay. I think I get it. I mean, this is still kind of a lot of this is still kind of foreign concept to me, because I'm still trying to figure out like some of the basics of how AI functions from a distributing and kind of understanding is not the right word. What's the aggregating and redistributing knowledge? Is that how we're supposed to think about it?
Yeah, actually, a different way to think about it is it's an inference engine, right? And that's what these things are all about. And what's actually really fascinating also about this notion of inference, can you infer things? So I'm going to go back to my pyramid example again. In the context of fixing the problems at the bottom layer. So we talked about squeezing the bottom part of this pyramid where you restrict access to data, you've classified the information properly. Let's suppose you got that perfect. Okay, not really. You can never get it perfect, but let's suppose you got it perfect. Could you still infer sensitive topics like layoffs from things like future building space or future equipment purchases? And the reality, of course, is yes, you can, right? We can infer that, and so can these machines. So just because you've fixed it at the bottom layer, it doesn't mean that you've solved the problem at the upper layer. You fundamentally still need to have a control at the knowledge level. And if you can provide that right control, then you actually free up the model to have access to the full set of data, full set of information. And so you address both the undersharing problem, but you also address the oversharing problem that we have as well.
Okay. That starts to make sense. And yeah, so that starts to make sense to me, because everybody that we've had conversations with wants to put every bit of knowledge in the history of ever into their AI into their AI model, right, into the data pool. And I would argue that sometimes that's a terrible idea, because the entirety of Twitter posts are as into AI is probably not going to be the way X, not the way you want it, unless you're creating a very specific type of AI.
Well, I think I think, Raph, if you did that and then you said output a movie that depicts civilization from X, you'd probably get Idiocracy. Right, like if we went, Idiocracy, that probably would have generated that from that. So you get that, but I get the point of, if you can give it as much information as possible, right? Because now we're relying on the inference to be able to determine if our guideline is you can't talk about layoffs or future expansion. If it has all the information, then it can build the context to say, oh, this is related to this information, right? So in the idea of like, oh, we didn't think about building contracts or these other things, but if it has that and sees it, it can say, oh, wait, no, that's part of this. Like I can infer that this is part of a layoff or an expansion. Somebody asks about it and they don't have that need to know, it can include that automatically.
See so again, I like your graphics, Anil, because that made sense to me. Because immediately when we first kind of started talking about the subject, I'm thinking like, oh, why don't you just not put that data in, like that direct data into the model? Like, duh, why wouldn't you just solve it that way? And the reminder of this is an inference model, it will infer things, is interesting, because that is correct. It will infer. It will. Because now I'm thinking of like all the times we've said, I can't tell you what the past, what time I don't know, what time the release of information is going to be, right? We've got a secret meeting, but nobody can know about it. And he sent like 5 meeting invites, for a specific time. Like, I'm not going to tell you when it is, but everybody's got to be there at 4 p.m. You're like, well, hold on a minute, right?
Yes.
Just because you didn't send the
Ours
meeting
invited.
invite. That's right. Who's invited? Like, you start sending out a whole bunch of meetings with HR and managers, and I suspect the inference engine will be like, something's happening here.
Right. Yeah, the pizza boxes to the Pentagon was another classic example of something interesting happening, right? So this ability to infer, again, is what makes it powerful, but is what makes it dangerous. And really, the fundamental
Yeah.
piece is we need to now need to know at the knowledge layer. Can people still work around it? Can someone bypass those controls? Yes, absolutely. It's still there. All right. Can you ask 100 questions that probe around the edges and fundamentally get to what you're trying to get at? Yes. But if you do that, maybe there's a monitoring system that says, it seems like this person is kind of dancing around the question, but not asking the question directly. What are you really trying to get at? Right. And I think those are the type of things that we eventually want to get to. I don't think we have I'm not going to claim that we have that ability now, but at least the data points are there to say, this person seems to be asking questions that may be semi-related to sensitive topics.
So give me the scope of the problem, because are we talking about like all the internet available? We're talking about enterprise AI, right?
Right.
Was that
Right.
okay?
Well, yeah. So we're talking about within the enterprise, you have all this data sucked up already in your Microsoft 365 environment. And what we've actually talked to a lot of folks about this. I would say roughly about 70% of people are stuck in their deployment of AI tools internally because of the oversharing problem. And because they're stuck, like, okay, what do we do next? Well, what we do is essentially use our need to know policy to quickly do precision targeting of content that is overshared. And this it's actually remarkable. Again, we're starting with need to know as a foundational principle and working our way down, versus what everyone else is doing, which is starting with the data and working their way up. And when you do the data working your way up, you end up with all this junk that is not really. I mean, it's like this is perfectly fine. Anyway, the point is that it's an interesting approach, and it takes much longer to go from the data up. When you come from the knowledge down, it greatly accelerates the whole process, where we can do some similar scans like within a day to be able to quickly look at your environment and say, okay, here are the problem points inside your organization.
What does it look like when you're saying defining need to know? Are you saying things like, people don't need to know about layoffs? Or, I mean, is it kind of broad like that, or no?
Well, it's not that people don't need. I mean, HR does need to, right? And the question is, who else needs to? And because there are people who have a legitimate need to know for things like the results of audits, the results of a due diligence effort, the results of harassment issues. There's all these things that people have a legitimate need to know for. And if you lock that out, you've again undermined you've crippled the whole point of these large language models. So it's a both combination. Let me see if I can phrase it slightly differently. Need to know fits into two mental models, if you think about it. One is the word need to know in the sense of, sorry, you don't have a need to know, therefore I'm going to restrict access to these things. The other mental model is more of an abundance model, which is, because of your job function, you have a need to know for these things that you don't already have access to. They may get them for you. Okay. That
So
second piece is transformational, because it moves us from being the department of no, sorry, I can't tell you, to the department of KNOW. Let me get things that you don't already have access to, because that is what you have a need to know for.
Okay, so you just opened up an entire new world there, because in my head I was
we went
thinking,
down a rabbit hole here.
I see what you did there. I love it. Yes. So this entire time, my head's been in the, okay, we're restricting. We're restricting certain people's access to certain knowledge, aggregate knowledge. But you're now talking about doing the reverse in certain cases where you're like, no, we should expand this for certain people because this is actually something you should know, but it's not directly accessible to you.
And
That's
if you think
interesting.
about it, we as humans have the ability to do this like rapidly. So you
Yeah.
have an all hands meeting and a marketing intern asks, hey, what's next quarter sales revenue? The CEO should be able to say, you know what, I'm not sure if I can share that with you immediately, right now, but I think you probably want to know which marketing campaigns are contributing most to sales. And here they are. Now, what you've done is you've equipped the marketing intern with exactly what they need to know to get their job done without divulging what may be prohibited from if you're a public company or even a private company, future earnings that may cause a bit of an insider trading issue.
That's interesting. I still can't. It's still. I don't know. Maybe I'm stuck, but like I'm still stuck a little bit in the like how is this sort of like a layer on top of your enterprise AI that you guys put? Is this kind of a okay?
Well, so again, let's talk about it from two different angles. There's a policy decision point, the policy enforcement point. The policy enforcement point are we already have those existing today in the form of like AI firewalls and guardrails.
Yeah.
The idea though here is that the guardrails are specific to each person, each function, each group, each job, the department. So it's, in other words, not everyone has the same mandatory guardrail. Each person, each group has a different set of guardrails. Okay. Next question is, what are those guardrails? Okay. So if you're asking the first question around how do you enforce these, again, the firewalls are out there to help enforce. Are the firewalls strong and robust and unbreakable? No way. Okay. Absolutely not. Let's just be clear, right? Then the second point is what are those guardrails themselves? What is the policy for those guardrails? Which question are you asking about how strong the enforcement can be? Can you actually enforce those, or how do you actually define them?
I'm kind of curious on the definition.
Okay,
like
sure.
How is that defined?
Yeah, sure. So let me give an analogy, and then I'll go back to how we would define it. So I mentioned earlier zero trust for networks. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Fundamentally, what does that mean? Well, the practical manifestation of that is we ended up segmenting our networks. We say, okay, not everyone should be able to reach everything. We need to make sure that only certain things can be reachable to certain things. Okay. In other words, we did network segmentation. Well,
Right.
if I came to you and said, what's your network segmentation policy? What parts of your environment should be able to talk to what? You'd be like, I don't know. I mean, where do I start? Well, one way to start is by looking at net flow. And you say, let me look at the existing flows, and from there, establish an initial policy. Because presumably, where you're going is legit, but someone can go in and say, nope, that doesn't look legit, cut that off. Okay. When you roll out a large language model, your knowledge base becomes flat. You allow for lateral movement of knowledge. So what we need to do is segment our knowledge. How do you start? If I asked you, what's your knowledge segmentation policy? In other words, what's your need to know policy? You'd be like, I don't know. Where do I start? Well, we look at knowledge flows. And what we also do, which is knowledge pings. The equivalent of knowledge pings are, let me see if this is actually reachable. I'm going to ask on behalf of a person in HR if they can access the product roadmap. Okay. And voila, someone in HR can access the product roadmap. My question to you is that within that person's need to know? Now, some organizations would say, yes, that's okay. And other organizations would say, no, that doesn't make sense. They shouldn't have a need to know. And now you've defined that policy. Now, again, every organization has slightly different variations, but each industry has different variations as well. So let's go back to like something simple like salary information. Who has a need to know for salary information? In most organizations, you would say it's primarily HR and certain level managers and so on and so forth. Right? Okay. Except when you go into government. because everyone has a need to know for government salaries. It's like pretty much
true.
It's public, right? So
Yeah.
the notion of need to know changes based on the industry as well. Anyway, the point is that we look at it from a knowledge flow standpoint, and knowledge pings, but also industry specific boundaries that are created.
Is a lot of this baselines, like baseline templates that come out for, hey, I want to do this. So, in most organizations, or even maybe in this type of industry, these are the default set of policies, and then we just kind of tweak those as we go.
right.
Like, oh yeah, for this one, no, we don't do it that way. We need to switch that policy. So a lot of that kind of is out of the box and predefined.
That's right. Yeah, and it also changes based on the size of the organization as well. So think a little startup versus like a fintech startup versus a, like a Bank of America. We're
Right.
gonna have slightly different policies in terms of need to know based on the size of the organization.
Okay. This is super interesting. If you have, if you're listening and you had AI firewalls on your bingo card, congratulations. We knew that was coming. So this is interesting because, and that's why I wanted to have this conversation. It fascinates me to think about mentally, just sort of and I love your graphics because that really kind of helps cement it for me. But to start thinking about a system of knowledge, a system of that takes disparate data, aggregates it into bits of knowledge that we can derive and divine from that, but then telling it, don't tell everybody all the things. Like take this, you still have this giant pool, like the pool doesn't change, right? So as you said, it doesn't get dumber, right? It just still has this big pool of information that it can distill the knowledge, but now you're gatekeeping who can get that knowledge rather than the other. This is fascinating. This is a really interesting place of, I guess, evolution in technology for me. James, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's super interesting. I mean, I think we've always struggled with this, clean the data first, right? Or try to protect it at the data level versus at the AI level. And I see this when we see, teams going out and they're like, hey, we want to implement AI and it's going to go pull from the data warehouse. And it's like, okay, but how are you restricting, right? Our web applications have roles. They have these different things set up, and that's how we restrict. But then it's like, oh, well, we're just going to come in through AI and let people pull it. And it's like, okay, well, how are you making sure that those people aren't getting that data, right? That they shouldn't be getting.
Yeah. So let me now go back and explain that same phenomenon, but using the pyramid again, the DIKW pyramid. So back in the day, when all we had were databases, you'd give people database level access, and people will write SQL queries and so on and so forth. But when we wrote applications on top of the database, you can now remove people's SQL level access. Okay. In fact, people didn't really want that. They wanted to just go into the application. It was just so much easier to gain access to what you need through the application. But you had to make sure you controlled access at the application level, right?
Yep.
Now we have a new layer on top of the application. Okay. And people generally will prefer to go in through that new layer rather than going to the application layer. And if you can properly control access at that new layer, it means that you can start removing access at the lower layers. And what is it that we struggle with? We struggle with access at those lower layers.
Lower layers. Oh man!
Yeah.
So you're solving all kinds of. So I was just about to ask. That was what I was thinking about. You guys were kind of talking, going back and forth about AI. I'm thinking like, yeah, but boy, wouldn't it be great if we could use this to solve the age-old problem of, at the share level, and maybe we get there. I mean, it depends. Of course, that depends heavily on people actually implementing AI, but these knowledge engines. But yes, that's everybody.
Yeah.
Does it change when we talk about, right, we want AI to know everything? Does it change going back to when AI is getting access to data? You get some people to say, oh, well, to have good AI, you have to have good, clean, structured data versus just, hey, go grab anything you want. Or like at this point, does that matter if we're saying, I don't care what the data looks like. Let the model have it, and it will learn the context and it'll learn all that stuff around it. Like, I don't need to clean my room before letting you in, right? Or do we have to, have everything organized? I think that's a common debate people have. Like, oh, we want to implement AI, but our data's not ready for it. If we get to this level, does it take some of that away?
So the result is, the reality is, we never are going to have a pristine environment. But at the same time, there's a more fundamental question, which is, do we actually want a pristine environment? Does that actually help us? And to give you a one way to answer that question, I'll point to some academic studies. One of them is called fairness through awareness. Through awareness. So we all, many of us, of course, are concerned about bias in these algorithms. And so naturally, our reaction is, let's clean up the data and remove that bias, right? Well, when we do that, what we end up with is more biased algorithms. Well, wait a second. Oh, that's not what we intended, right? You end up with more. So going back to that pyramid, you squeeze the bottom part of the pyramid. What happens to the model? The model gets worse. And the reason why it gets worse is just conceptually think about it this way. Let's suppose I removed gender and race from, like, explicitly gender and race from my data set. When I get a result, I no longer can anchor it on, oh, it's biased against women. We don't even know, because that's not even a factor anymore, right? It's not a factor that we can gauge and say, hey, wait, I don't want bias against women. Let's correct the model. But we don't have that data point to anchor anymore, and therefore it just gets worse. And why is it worse? Is because there's so many other attributes that factor into the model that are inferred that says, oh, this is a woman, and therefore that's why we're going to be biased against the woman, in the algorithm. But if you don't have that one feature, then you no longer can anchor on adjusting the algorithm so that you can remove that bias at the knowledge level, right? So again, if you fix it at the data level, you end up basically screwing yourself, and you don't have a way to counter it.
Yeah, it's not really fixing it. You're hobbling. You're kind of tying one hand behind your AI's back. There we go. There's an analogy for you.
Yeah. So let me and I love the mental model because it helps really crystallize our thinking in a couple of different ways. We live in a very messy world, right? And people are exposed to all these different things, and we're not sure exactly, we don't want our kids to be exposed to this type of stuff. So at the end of the day, what is it that we teach them? We teach them discretion. We teach them wisdom. Wisdom is at the very top of that pyramid, right? Yeah. We teach them tools for thinking, and to say, look, you're going to see all this misinformation, disinformation, people lying to you. How do you have discernment? Okay. That is fundamentally what's missing today. Now, again, that's all in our heads, but we need to be able to now codify some of that in explicit rules, so that a machine can take what's in our head and actually start following the rules that we establish that we haven't expressed up until now.
I like it. This has been helpful. I know we're out of time, but this has been super helpful. I thought we were going to have a discussion purely on data, and you're really good with analogies. So I appreciate all the help there, trying to get my brain over it. James, anything you want to ask before we drop out here?
No, I think that's it. Like, this was really interesting. Like you, it's a eye-opening thing to see, looking at it kind of from the complete opposite direction.
Yeah. So coming in from this, not even the opposite, it's like the natural direction of how we think about things. Again, need to know is not a new principle. It's a foundational principle for all security. And yet we've somehow forgotten that that's our starting point. And once we recognize that's our starting point, so many things become so much easier. And what is it that Gnostic is focused on? We're coming in from that layer to help organizations get unstuck in their deployment. Why are they stuck? It's because they're coming in backwards into this problem rather than coming in forwards from the foundational principle of need to know itself. And so if there are companies who are stuck in their AI deployment, especially with tools like Copilot, definitely check us out, because we're taking this this more foundational approach. I was going to say it's a novel approach, but really it's not novel if you think about it. It's the starting point for all of security to begin with.
Yeah.
And
that's fair.
Take that approach. That's what we do.
All right. Well, that's been fantastic, folks. I hope you learned something. Somebody asked me recently. We're coming up on almost 700 shows. Why we still do this, and what keeps me going. It's conversations like this, sitting with folks like yourself, that give me a new perspective, give me something to think about. And it's interesting. Some of the most interesting conversations we've had, James, are with folks that are in these startups, that are in these kind of niche pieces of our environment in security, because we're so focused on insecurity. How do I restrict? How do I lock down? How do I keep somebody from accessing? How do I throw away as much as possible to give you as little as possible so you can break as little as possible? But you're turning that, like, so you're showing us that it's possible to flip that whole thing on its head.
Yeah.
And still not fundamentally screw up security. So thanks for joining us. This has been a lot of fun. I'm gonna let this process for a bit, folks. If you've got if this has gotten the hamster back on the wheel, thinking a little bit, leave us a comment, or reach out to Sounil or James and I. We're on the we monitor the LinkedIn group that hopefully you're all part of. When I post this, if you've got thoughts, love to hear them. So no, thanks for joining. This has been a blast. Gnostic is the name of the company.
Yes, it is Gnostic.ai.
Okay.
KNOSTIC.ai.
Yeah. Okay. We'll give that a shot. We'll give it a look. James, this has been fun. My brain is full. It's time to go. Thanks, you guys, for listening. This has been another Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast. We'll see you guys another time, another place. Take care.